Chapter 3 Miracles Take a Little Longer, Bletchley. Section 1 Tips and Silas. In the winter of 1939, MI6 came under scrutiny and fierce criticism within Whitehall, intensified by the Venlo fiasco. Stuart Menzies, knowing the precariousness of his position at sea, compiled a 26-page document defending his service, in which he risked playing one card which might, and did, save his bacon. He promised his masters that the country was about to reap the fruits of MI6's liaison with Allied Secret Services in a fashion which should be of inestimable benefits to the Air Ministry within a few weeks, and probably to the Admiralty within a month or two. The significance of this vaguely expressed claim was that Menzies believed that Bletchley Park, with the help of the French and Poles, was close to cracking some German ciphers. Such successes could go far indeed towards compensating for MI6's human failure. His expectations would remain unfulfilled for much of the year that followed. Few, even within the intelligence community, dared to hope that Britain could emulate, far less surpass, the 1914-18 code-breaking triumphs of the Admiralty's Room 40. Admiral Godfrey, head of naval intelligence, wrote to Menzies on the 18th of November saying that whether or not cryptanalysts will ever again give us the knowledge we had of the German movements in the late war, MI6 should exert itself to plant agents in enemy ports to report shipping movements. Godfrey did not seem to expect much from the codebreakers. In peacetime, few nations commit their finest brains to national security. Brilliant people seldom choose careers in intelligence, or, for that matter, in the armed forces. A struggle for national survival alone makes it possible for a government to mobilize genius or people possessing something close to it, in the interests of the war effort. The British, and latterly the Americans, did this more effectively than any other participants in World War II. A remarkable portion of their nation's brightest and best sooner or later found themselves performing tasks worthy of their talents in scientific or technical research, and especially in intelligence, which absorbed thousands of outstanding intellects from many walks of life. The outbreak of war enabled the German section of British military intelligence, for instance, to recruit writers and academics. One of them, Noel Annan, a Cambridge don who had only a passable acquaintance with German and French, observed wonderingly, "Within a week, I was piecing together the reports of agents in the Balkans and the early stutterings of Ultra." Donald McLachlan, a journalist who served under Godfrey at the Admiralty, afterwards argued that all wartime intelligence departments should be run by civilians in uniform, because they are unburdened by the lifetime prejudices of career soldiers, sailors, and airmen. It is the lawyer, the scholar, the traveler, the banker, even the journalist, who shows the ability to resist where the career men tend to bend. Career officers and politicians have a strong interest in cooking raw intelligence to make their master's favorite dishes. MI6 remained until 1945 under the leadership of its old hands, but most of Britain's secret war machine passed into the hands of able civilians in uniform who, after an interval of months or in some cases years while they were trained and their skills recognized, progressively improved the quality of intelligence analysis. The Admiralty's submarine tracking room was directed by Roger Wynne, a barrister and future judge. General Sir Bernard Montgomery's chief of intelligence from Alamein to Lumberg Heath was the Oxford Don Edgar Bill Williams, latterly a brigadier. Reg Jones made himself a legend in scientific intelligence. These men, and a few hundred others throughout the armed forces, spent much of the war exploiting and assessing information derived overwhelmingly from interception and decryption of the enemy's wireless traffic. Bill Williams, who served in the Mediterranean until 1943 and in Europe thereafter, stated in an important 1945 report, "It must be made quite clear that Ultra and Ultra only put intelligence on the map." Until decrypts began to become available in bulk in 1942, intelligence was the Cinderella of the staff. Information about the enemy was frequently treated as interesting rather than valuable, though, of course, this attitude varied according to the commander. Skepticism was often merited, because much material was downright specious. The 1940 War Diary of the Army's Middle East Intelligence Section in Cairo included comically frivolous snippets. All Hungarian cabaret artistes have been ordered to leave the country by the end of May. Data about the Italian army was scanty, so that on the 9th of August, the section recorded, "The present location and organization of Libyan troops in eastern Cyrenaica is obscure." A despondent staff officer added a week later, "There has been no further reliable information of fresh Italian ground units or formations arriving in Libya from overseas." On the 27th of September, the British High Command's weekly intelligence summary included a paragraph on domestic conditions in Germany. A neutral traveler to the Leipzig fair, whose personal observations are believed reliable, reports that relations between the Nazi Party and the army are not good. 3 months later, the head of MI6's political section wrung his hands. "It is piteous to find ourselves in this state of ignorance about both Germany's internal condition and economy." Only when Allied warlords were empowered to read the messages being exchanged between enemy generals in the field and their higher headquarters was skepticism about the value of intelligence replaced by increasingly fervent belief. Ultra forced commanders-in-chief, not to mention the Prime Minister, to treat senior intelligence officers with a respect they had seldom received in the pre-Bletchley universe. Brigadier Ian Jacob of the War Cabinet Secretariat said, "My impression is that once the Ultra business got well established, Churchill didn't look at anything else." Eisenhower's intelligence chief, Kenneth Strong, wrote in 1943, in a memorandum on training staff officers, "We no longer depend on agents and cloak and dagger sources for our information. Modern methods have completely transformed intelligence." He meant code breaking, of course, and in Britain, the fountainhead of such activity was the Government Code and Cipher School at Bletchley. In the months following the outbreak of war, GC&CS expanded dramatically with the arrival of a stream of academics, many of them earmarked by its recruiters before the war. Though some were seconded from the armed forces, it was understood that there was no need to train the university's contingent to march blanco webbing and name the parts of a rifle. They remained their sallow, tweedy, pipe-smoking young selves when housed in lodgings around the dreary suburban town, and enlisted on the government payroll without uniform or ceremony. 20-year-old mathematician Keith Beatty found his landlady demanding an assurance from his employer that he was not a despised conscientious objector, before he joined the growing body of academics working on a task of supreme importance to their country, fulfillment of which might do something to assuage its shocking vulnerability. What was the task? Bletchley's little band, 169 strong in 1939, including support staff, understood only that the nation's enemies communicated in a multitude of codes and ciphers, vulnerable to interception. If even a portion of these combinations of numbers and letters could be rendered intelligible, information might be gained of priceless value to the war effort. Nobody knew in the beginning Whether a given message hijacked from the airwaves might be an order from Hitler for his armies to march on Warsaw, or a request from a Luftwaffe airfield in eastern Germany for a delivery of filing cabinets. Ahead of the codebreakers lay a mammoth menu of requirements which could only be addressed as mobilization sluggishly made available ears, brains, and hands to monitor the enemy's frequencies around the clock, log some of his vast output of messages, fix the locations and possible identities of the senders, diplomatic, police, military, naval, or air force. Then came the much greater challenge of discovering what the messages meant. All radio communications involved a trade-off between speed and security. At the simplest level, battlefield direction by land, sea, and air required some voice linkage. This enabled the instantaneous passage of orders and information, at the cost of being overheard by anybody else who cared to tune to a given frequency. Crude security could be introduced by using coded call signs in place of names and such like. During the Battle of Britain, fighter controllers added 5,000 feet to indicated altitudes to confuse eavesdroppers. But voice messaging was inherently insecure. Sensitive information should never be passed verbally, though it often was. Most military messages were instead wirelessed by Morse key. Low-level material could be rapidly encrypted under battlefield conditions by relatively unsophisticated personnel using so-called hand or field ciphers, usually involving groups of 2 or 3 letters or numbers. The Kriegsmarine employed 27 variants. More sensitive traffic issuing from higher echelons was translated by machine-generated or manual ciphers, usually involving combinations of 4 or 5 letters or numbers. The British thought, justifiably, highly of the security of their Type X machines, though they never had enough of them. The Americans rightly trusted their Cigaba, a 15-rotor system. For substantial periods between 1939 and 1943, the Germans broke some Allied codes, including those of the U.S. State Department and military attachés, along with the traffic of several exile governments, notably the Poles and Free French. They sometimes also accessed messages of all 3 British services, including the RAF's 4-character cipher, and later had successes in attacking products of the U.S. Army's M209 field ciphering machine. It deserves emphasis that Allied code security weaknesses and enemy achievements in exploiting them gave the Germans much more operational assistance than some Western historians acknowledge, especially in the Battle of the Atlantic. However, higher British, American, and Russian communications defied enemy scrutiny. Nazi eavesdropping on transatlantic telephone conversations between Churchill and Roosevelt told Berlin little of value. Modern claims that the Germans broke into Russian higher ciphers deserve to be treated with caution, certainly from 1942 onwards. There is no evidence that Hitler's generals profited from any such insights. If they had, they would have been less often deluded by Soviet deceptions. Most German senior officers, though by no means all their cryptographers, were confident that Enigma ciphering machines, which scrambled messages by means of shifting rotors and a plug board, and rendered them comprehensible only by a matching machine with identical settings, were immune to the attention of any enemy, and indeed to the workings of the human mind. It is unsurprising that in 1939 they discounted the possibility that electromechanical technology might dramatically accelerate exposure of the Enigma's secrets, because it did not then exist. It is extraordinary, however, that such serene confidence persisted through 6 years that followed, even following the discovery that the Poles had broken some pre-war Enigma traffic, and several warnings from their own experts. Amazing hubris was expressed by the Wehrmacht's last signals chief, Lieutenant General Albert Braun. who preened himself before his Allied captors after the war ended. The achievements of German communications intelligence may speak in favor of the German type of intelligence organization. His organization, he said, gave German commanders a hitherto unattained degree of signal security. The British breaking of the Enigma, then subsequently and separately of German teleprinter traffic, was a progressive, incremental operation which attained maturity only between 1943 and 1945, and was never uninterrupted or comprehensive. Even at peaks, only about half of all intercepts were read, many of them too late to provide practical assistance at the sharp end. What was done at Bletchley Park was indeed miraculous, but the codebreakers were never able to walk on all of the water all of the time. The 1939-40 phony war conferred few benefits on Britain, but it granted GC and CS precious time to bolster its strength and refine its methods. Without mechanical aids, Bletchley's brainstormers made modest and delayed breaches in a number of enemy ciphers. The Germans employed acronyms and codenames which took weeks or months for their enemies to interpret. The importance of what happened at Bletchley in the first 2 years of war was not that it enabled Britain's generals to avert or arrest a disastrous run of defeats, which it certainly did not, but that it lit a candle of hope about what the codebreakers and their embryo technology might accomplish in the future. It enabled the directors of the war effort to lay upon the board a few scattered pieces of a vast jigsaw, which would be filled only during the Allies' years of victory. Bletchley Park, Station X, Box 111, care of the Foreign Office, was a notably ugly Victorian pile of bastard architectural origins, surrounded by 55 acres of trees and grasslands, located 50 miles from London. It was purchased in 1938 to house GC and CS at a safe distance from German bombs by Admiral Sir Hugh Sinclair, then head of MI6. As legend has it, he used £7,500 out of his own pocket, but more plausibly, he paid with secret funds under his control. Whatever MI6's human weaknesses, the service's chiefs, especially Sinclair, deserve full credit for backing the establishment of Bletchley at a time when resources were desperately constrained. Work began at once on laying direct phone and teleprinter lines to London, and in the following year, MI6's skeleton team of cryptanalysts moved from Broadway to the Park, where they came under the orders of Alistair Denniston. One of his colleagues from the old Admiralty days, Dilwyn Knox, an expert on ancient Egyptian papyri, became an early Bletchley stalwart. The most prominent of the younger recruits were Gordon Welchman of Sydney Sussex College, Cambridge, Hugh Alexander, Stuart Milner Barry, John Jeffreys, and Alan Turing. This last, the 27-year-old son of an Indian civil servant and the product of an austere and emotionally arid childhood, had just returned from a stint at Princeton clutching one of his own creations, a so-called electric multiplier machine mounted on a breadboard. His headmaster at Sherborne had once written, "If he is to stay at a public school, he must aim at becoming educated. If he is to be solely a scientific specialist, then he is wasting his time." In the headmaster's terms, Turing had indeed been wasting his time. He had evolved into a shy, narrow obsessive. Noel Annan wrote, "I liked his sly, secret humor. His inner life was more real to him than actuality. He disliked authority wherever he was, and enjoyed games and treasure hunts and silliness. Turing was the purest type of homosexual, longing for affection and love that lasted. More even than by his sexuality and his often childlike immaturity, however, his tragedy was to be afflicted by the exquisitely painful loneliness of genius. Other drafts of young academics followed, variously codebreakers and linguists, together with the first of what became successive waves of young women who would play a vital role in the operations of BP. The first two of these were daughters of golfing partners of Denniston, reflecting the importance of personal connections in Bletchley's recruitment process in the early days, before industrialization became inescapable. Indeed, the whole wartime intelligence machine emphasized the coziness of the upper reaches of British life. Oxford University Press was entrusted with the responsibility for printing vast quantities of codes, maps, and reports, because of its pre-war experience producing examination papers under secure conditions. The Admiralty's liaison with OUP was handled by Margaret Godfrey, wife of the Director of Naval Intelligence. The Royal Navy's topographical photographic library was housed in the basement of the nearby Bodleian Library, which eventually dispatched 300,000 images a month to operational areas. The World War I intelligence veteran Admiral Sir William Blinker Hall introduced Godfrey, his modern successor, to the City of London banking giants Montague Norman, Olaf Hambro, and the Rothschilds, who helped to identify suitable recruits for the NID. Candidates being scrutinized for Bletchley were often asked, "Do you have religious scruples about reading other people's correspondence?" 20-year-old Harry Hensley was interviewed at St. John's College, Cambridge, by Alistair Denniston and Colonel John Tiltman, the senior codebreaker. They said, "You've traveled a bit, we understand. You've done quite well in your tripos. What do you think of government service? Would you rather have that than be conscripted?" Hensley would indeed, and joined the naval section located in Bletchley's Hut 4. Through the icy winter of 1939-40, such men and women wrestled with Enigma traffic. Working conditions were dismal, with staff muffled in overcoats and mittens. The first break into a Luftwaffe Enigma key, designated green, is thought to have been made on the 25th of October, 1939. In December, by unaided intellectual effort, Alan Turing is believed to have broken 5 days' worth of old naval messages. By the end of March, the French, or rather the Poles working at France's Station Bruno, had broken 20 days' worth of old signals and a BP about 30, all Luftwaffe traffic. Turing was much more importantly engaged. He compiled a 150-page treatise on Enigma, studded with schoolboyish blots, deletions, and illegibilities. While most codebreakers addressed each other by first names or nicknames, heedless of age and status, almost everyone knew Turing as Prof, rather than as Alan. When his Enigma study was circulated later in 1940, it became known as the Prof's book. He also set about fulfilling his concept for a bomb, a primitive but revolutionary electromechanical device for exploring multiple mathematical combinations. This borrowed its name, though not its design, from the Polish bomby, and would be capable of examining the 17,576 possible wheel deployments for a 3-rotor Enigma in about 20 minutes. The order for the first machine was placed in October 1939, and the prototype became operational 6 months later. Meanwhile, outside in the park, workmen sawed and hammered at an ever-widening array of low wooden buildings which housed the growing staff. Eventually, only administrators worked in the main building, where the telephone switchboard was established in the ballroom. In the huts, signals were shifted from one section to another on a small trolley pushed along a makeshift wooden tunnel. Hut 8 attacked German naval traffic, which was then passed to Hut 4 for translation and processing. Hut 3 performed the same function for Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe traffic, decrypted by Hut 6. The former would eventually play a pivotal role in Allied wartime intelligence, but in its early incarnation it had a staff of just 4. Frank Lucas, who was one of them, wrote, "On a snowy January morning of 1940, in a small, bleak wooden room with nothing but a table and 3 chairs, the first bundle of Enigma decodes appeared. We had no idea what they were about to disclose. A few score yards away, Hut 6, run by Gordon Welchman, wrestled with Army Luftwaffe Red Key traffic, which was the first to be broken in bulk. From the outset, pains were taken to disguise from all but the most senior operational commanders the fact that information was being gained from code breaking. This gave an unintended boost to the prestige of MI6, and to that of Stuart Menzies in particular. When Reg Jones gave a disguised report based on an ultra-decrypt to the RAF's Director of Signals, Air Commodore Nutting, the airmen professed astonished admiration for the courage of the presumed spies who had provided the information, saying, "By Jove, you've got some brave chaps working for you." The ever-growing scale of the enemy traffic to be trawled was intimidating. It is a measure of the expansion of communications as a branch of warfare that by August 1943, 305,000 personnel among the Luftwaffe's total strength of 2.3 million were employed on signals duties, transmitting, receiving, or processing. And the same was true on both sides of the war, and of all armed forces. At GCNCS, there were inevitable personality clashes. Gordon Welchman, whose creative contribution became second only to that of Turing, and whose organizational skills were also priceless, found it hard to work with the highly strung and fractious Dilwyn Knox, a contender for the hotly contested title of Bletchley's Star Eccentric. A notoriously awful driver, Knox giggled, "It's amazing how people smile and apologize to you when you knock them over." He sustained a stream of intemperate complaints and demands to Denniston, his old comrade from Room 40, about staff shortages, working conditions, low pay, together with the intrusion of an excessive authority conceded to non-cryptanalysts, service intelligence officers who maul and conceal our results. Knox was seriously ill with the cancer that would kill him in February 1943. But meanwhile, he and Welchman bickered. The older man accused the younger of exceeding his narrow initial brief, and was also impatient of Turing, writing, "He is very difficult to anchor down. He is very clever, but quite irresponsible, and throws out a mass of suggestions of all degrees of merit. I have just, but only just, enough authority and ability to keep him and his ideas in some sort of order and discipline. But he is very nice about it all." Turing prompted mirth by joining Bletchley's home guard, because he was seized by an impulse to learn to shoot, then provoked the apoplectic rage of its colonel by absenting himself from parades once he had fulfilled his private purpose. His unworldliness could provoke real exasperation among those under relentless pressure to produce results. A colleague spoke of Turing's almost total inability to make himself understood. There were plenty of minor tantrums lower down the hierarchy, unsurprising when staff were performing stressful tasks through long hours in bleak working conditions. Angus Wilson, the later novelist, once vented such a storm of rage that a colleague said wearily, "Do stop it, Angus, otherwise we'll put you in the lake." Wilson retorted defiantly, "Don't worry, I'll do it myself," and duly plunged into the water in front of the house. On another such occasion, he hurled a bottle of ink at a wren. Many wartime codebreakers suffered temporary or permanent physical or mental collapses brought on by their work. William Friedman, one of America's pioneer practitioners, underwent a nervous breakdown in January 1941, which incapacitated him for 3 months. Hugh Trevor Roper languished for several months at about the same time, and others regularly succumbed. German signals were at first intercepted by a battery of Army wireless operators stationed in an old naval fort at Chatham, a role later assumed by Gambier Perry's organization at Wadden Hall. In the early war years, there were never enough operators, and both the RAF and the Army were reluctant to acknowledge the priority of meeting GC&CS's demands. Signals were brought in batches to Bletchley's guardroom by motorcycle couriers, at all hours and often in dreadful weather, then distributed between the relevant huts. From an early stage, the codebreakers learned to identify German senders by the unencrypted preamble to their message texts, none of which was longer than 250 words. It was then a matter of sitting hunched over a deal table through the hours of a shift, pondering a jumble of numbers and letters from which only men, and Bletchley's handful of women, with remarkable logic or mathematical powers, might hope to extract fragments of meaning. The ideal cryptanalyst, Stephen Budiansky, has written, was Beethoven with the soul of an accountant. When Christopher Morris was a new recruit to Bletchley, he heard one of his senior colleagues ask the requirements for the job and respond laconically, "Oh, I suppose a sharp pencil and a piece of squared paper." Morris himself thought that the main requisites, except at the exalted level of Knox, Turing, Welchman, and the later Max Newman, were patience, accuracy, stamina, a reasonably clear head, some experience, and an ability to work with others. They opened what became vast card indexes, stacked in shoeboxes along the sides of the huts, cataloging enemy units, personnel, code names, locations, abbreviations, and military hardware. Different Enigma keys were distinguished by color, for instance, yellow, green, red, and blue, respectively indicating Norway, Wehrmacht, Army Luftwaffe, and air training codes. When a new word came up in the message, you were translating, wrote Hugh Skillen, a new type of jet fuel or machine part. You looked for it, and if it was not there, the indexer put it in with a reference, time, and date stamp. Bletchley's meticulous record-keeping became a critical element in its triumphs. For security reasons, the park's operations were rigidly compartmentalized, and there was little exchange of information or gossip between sections. Even Welchman remarked years later how little he knew about what colleagues were doing a few yards away from his own hut. As the staff grew from hundreds into thousands, facilities lagged behind. A section head complained that 200 men and women enjoyed the use of just one lavatory. The food in the Bletchley canteen was poor, even by wartime standards. Former debutante Sarah Norton one night found a cooked cockroach in her meat. I was about to return it to the catering manageress when my friend Osla, who had the appetite of a lioness with cubs, snatched the plate and said, "What a waste! I'll eat it." The nearest available delicacies outside the wire were to be found at the Station Inn in Bletchley Town, which offered oxheart. Welchman recalled having to provide his own newspaper to wrap fish and chips at the local shop. The codebreakers worked around the clock in 3 rotating shifts, starting with 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. When the exhausted men and women cycled or took a bus through the blackout to their lodgings, they found few comforts: dim lighting, hot baths often rationed to 1 a week, draconian rules about intersex visiting. It is deeply impressive that those who worked at Bletchley sustained such dedication while working day after day, month after month, in a drab world devoid of glamour excitement, variety, glory, and decorations. In Hut 3, the watch sat around a horseshoe table, translating deciphered signals, each one resembling a telegraph flimsy, forwarded from Hut 6. Ideally, decrypts were composed of complete German words, but often there were interruptions and corruptions in the texts, which demanded leaps of imagination from the linguists. William Millward recalled with shame a night when he invented a place named Senke, near Katara, in the North African desert, having forgotten that Senke was the German word for a geographical depression. Schoolmasters proved ideal as watch chiefs, wrote Peter Calvocoresi, because they were naturally meticulous. If not satisfied, they would throw back a translation at even an eminent professor. It reminded me of chief examiners at A level, who would send back scripts to an assistant examiner to remark. No one could work at GC and CS who did not love brain games. There were dreary, idle yet sleepless lulls when no traffic arrived for the watches to work on. Peter Hilton once used such a doodle time to compose a palindrome. Doc note I dissent. A fast never prevents a fatness. I diet on cod. Although Alan Turing was acknowledged as the highest intellect at Bletchley, its achievement was supremely a team effort. The creative input of some others, Welchman prominent among them, was almost as important as that of Turing. One night in February 1940, several months before the arrival of the first bomb, 21-year-old Cambridge mathematician John Harivel was smoking a pipe before the fire in his billet and concentrating furiously on encoded messages even as he drifted in and out of a doze. An inspiration struck him as he gazed with the mind's eye at a German Enigma operator. He perceived such a man starting his morning's work bored or weary or hungover, and thus not troubling to change the previous day's ring setting on his machine before starting to cipher messages. Harivel scarcely slept that night, as he went on to deduce how such an act of carelessness might be detected, then exploited to break a message. Welchman, who had supervised him at Cambridge, immediately saw the importance of this flash of insight, a marriage of mathematical brilliance to a grasp of human weakness. He told the young man fervently that he would not be forgotten, and indeed his inspiration became known as the Harivel tip. Dilwyn Knox had already identified another entry point to messages, rooted in operator errors and text settings, what the codebreakers christened Sillis or Sillies. Welchman wrote later that Bletchley remained entirely dependent on Harivel tips and Sillis from the invasion of France to the end of the Battle of Britain. In other words, until the arrival of the bombs, codebreaking was done by raw brainpower, without significant mechanical assistance. At this early stage, the British lagged behind their American counterparts in exploiting technology. Both the U.S. Army and U.S. Navy codebreaking teams used Hollerith punch card sorters, of a kind that only began to appear at Bletchley in May 1940, because Chief Codebreaker Colonel John Tiltman had been skeptical about them. Ultra provided no important material during the summer of 1940, but several indications about the postponement of Sea Lion, the Nazi invasion of Britain, notable among them a September Luftwaffe message ordering the dismantling of air transport equipment at Dutch airfields. Fred Winterbotham, the MI6 officer who eventually became overseer of the Special Liaison Unit network, which fed ultra decrypts to commanders in the field, described the first bomb, christened Agnus, corrupted to Agnes, as resembling some Eastern goddess who was destined to become the Oracle of Bletchley. It was installed in Hut 11 on the 14th of March 1940, but suffered substantial teething troubles. Gordon Welchman made an important contribution to Turing's creation by devising a diagonal board, an element introduced into the first really effective model, which came into service in mid-August. Agnes and its many successors were not computers, because they had no memory. They were instead electromechanical key-finding aids, 6.5 feet high and 7 wide, mounted in bronze-colored cabinets and containing 36 banks of high-speed electrically driven Enigma replicas. Each bomb contained 11 miles of wiring and 1 million soldered contacts. Built by the British Tabulating Machine Company at Letchworth, they depended partly on components assembled in scores of local village halls by casual workers who had no clue of the importance to the war effort of the 26-way cables and the other small electrical parts they contributed. With the assistance of a clue or crib, a vital identifying link, usually a codebreaker's guess about the nature of part of a given signal, a bomb could test millions of mathematical possibilities for the settings of 3 Enigma rotors. Figuratively, Agnes and her kin were bloodhounds, needing a slipper or handkerchief to take up a scent. If there was no crib, the bomb could not solve the key. But mercifully often, there was one. Subsequent machines, miracles of reliability given their continuous operations, were given their own names by the Wrens who manned them around the clock, usually those of warships, Warspite, Victory, and such like. The bombs did not take in enemy cipher messages and disgorge them in fluent German. They were instead priceless accelerators. Once the codebreakers secured an insight into the nature of a given signal or traffic stream. Also useful was a battery of British Type X cipher machines, modified to match the behavior of Enigmas, on which Wren operators tested speculative message solutions. One of the principal constraints on codebreaking, especially between 1940 and 1942, was that access to the scarce technology had to be apportioned between competing claimants of the 3 services, and there was never enough bomb time to go around. Throughout 1940, human brainpower remained the dominant element in Bletchley's successes, which increased with every passing week. It was the Herival tip, not bombs, that enabled the team to crack the Army Luftwaffe red key in May. The overwhelming bulk of enemy traffic read through the rest of the year, around 1,000 messages a day, was that of the Luftwaffe, and until the end of the war, Air Force material was accessed more swiftly than that of the other services. An important requirement for success was what the codebreakers called depth, possession of sufficient messages in a given key to give them playing space for calculations and speculations. Luftwaffe signals provided many clues to the Wehrmacht's parallel activities, but in the early days interpretation was impeded by lack of understanding of German terminology and abbreviations. In September 1940, Bletchley broke some traffic from Göring's Pathfinder unit, KGR-100, which enabled it to forecast the targets of several bomber raids. But warning was of little practical usefulness to the defenders when hard power, in the form of radar-guided RAF night fighters, was lacking in both numbers and effectiveness. As more bombs were built, by 1945 there were 211 of them, they were dispersed around the London suburbs as a precaution against an enemy air attack on Bletchley. The operators, chiefly young women of the WRNS, found long hours beside the hot, smelly, clattering machines extraordinarily grueling, especially when they were obliged to use tweezers to adjust the delicate electrical wiring. Some girls were unnerved by the monotonous racket. One of them said, "It was like a lot of knitting machines working, a kind of tickety-clickety noise." They went home with their shirt cuffs blackened by a fine spray of oil from the bomb's revolving drums. Naval Enigma remained for many months impenetrable. This was partly because of its system of 8 rotors, of which 3 were used at any one time, posed greater difficulties than the Army's 5, and partly also because the Kriegsmarine's operators were more disciplined than their Luftwaffe counterparts, and committed fewer errors to provide openings for Bletchley. There was a brief spasm of success in late April 1940 when 5 days' traffic was read, but thereafter more than a year elapsed. An eternity in the minds of those who wrestled vainly with the problem day after day, week upon week, before the big breakthrough. Denniston said gloomily to Frank Birch, a 1918 veteran of Room 40 who now headed the naval section, "You know, the Germans don't mean you to read their stuff, and I don't suppose you ever will." Alan Turing himself had been dallying with the Kriegsmarine's traffic almost since his arrival at Bletchley. A colleague, Hugh Alexander, observed that he became engaged because nobody else seemed to be making headway, and in his remote fashion he was fascinated by the abstract challenge. It was Turing who devised a new method christened Banburismus, employing long punched paper sheets manufactured in the town of Banbury, which assisted the first important breaks into Kriegsmarine messages by reducing the number of possible Enigma rotor orders to be tested from 336 to around 18. This system was introduced in the spring of 1941, just as British losses to U-boats began to become alarming. On land, the British in those days lacked power and opportunity to do much with such knowledge of the Wehrmacht's movements as they secured, and there was a large element of luck about what messages were broken. In North Africa, in early 1941, the British Army profited from some good SIGINT, derived from eavesdropping on the Italians, but few Enigma messages were broken quickly enough to assist decision-making on the battlefield. At sea, by contrast, there was an early golden prize for GC and CS's labors. The impetus towards success was provided by a series of captures far out on the ocean, which dramatically increased Bletchley's knowledge of the enemy's naval communications. On the 23rd of February 1941, British commandos raiding the Lofoten Islands seized the German armed trawler Krebs, from which spare rotors for a naval Enigma were recovered, though the machine itself had been thrown overboard. This pinch prompted the Royal Navy to launch an operation explicitly designed to capture more Enigma material, targeting German weather reporting trawlers between Iceland and Jan Mayen Island. On the 7th of May, a sweep by 3 cruisers located and seized the München, but too late to save its Enigma and associated coding data from the Arctic deep. On the 25th of June, the Navy caught its sister vessel, the Lauenberg, again minus its Enigma, but with a useful haul of cipher material. Hut 8 now had enough information to read some U-boat signals, but the seizure which opened the traffic to fluent decryption was the fruit of chance and high courage, rather than of design. On the 9th of May, 1941, a convoy escort group attacked and forced to the surface Julius Lempe's U-110, a boarding party from the HMS Bulldog, commanded by Sub-Lieutenant David Baum, secured the submarine, prevented its sinking, and brought back to his destroyer pearls beyond price, documentation for current Enigma. Though U-110 later sank under tow, fortunately so from a security viewpoint, the short signal book, officer ciphering instructions, and other materials reached Bletchley safely, and the secret of the submarine's capture was preserved beyond the war's end. An Enigma machine was also recovered, but perversely, this was the least useful element of the booty, because Bletchley had one already, together with assorted rotors seized in other pinches. Within days, Hut 8 was reading a steady stream of German naval messages. Ralph Erskine, one of the foremost experts on code breaking at Bletchley, believes that the park was already close to reading the Kriegsmarine traffic, even without the U-110 hull. What is for certain, however, is that it was impossible to break the U-boat ciphers without the assistance of captured material, which would again become a vital issue later in the war. The breakthrough into the Kriegsmarine ciphers came just too late to influence the pursuit of the Bismarck in the latter days of May 1941. Conventional direction finding on the behemoth's wireless transmissions, supported by air reconnaissance, were the key factors in enabling the Royal Navy to intercept and sink it on the morning of the 27th, though assisted in the last stage by decryption of a Luftwaffe signal revealing Brest as Bismarck's destination. Thereafter, Bletchley produced a steady stream of messages that revealed U-boat positions and intended courses. The so-called Hydra cipher was laid bare, and other keys were progressively broken. The more the park knew, the more it was able to discover. The flow of decrypts was never assured, however, and disturbing delays sometimes took place. Huffduff, high-frequency direction finding, played an important secondary role in the location of U-boats. The outcome was a relentless shift in the balance of advantage in the Battle of the Atlantic through 1941 and into 1942. Here was a case where intelligence indisputably and importantly influenced events. Bletchley was also reading a significant portion of Italian naval traffic. On the 25th of March, 1941, one of the small number of women decryptors, 19-year-old mathematician Mavis Lever, in Dillwyn Knox's team, he was famously supportive of talented girls in a male-dominated institution, played a critical role in breaking a message which revealed that the Italian fleet would shortly put to sea to attack British convoys. The warning enabled the Mediterranean C&C Admiral Sir Andrew Cunningham to contrive an encounter off Cape Matapan during the afternoon and night of the 28th of March, which ended in a striking victory for the Royal Navy. By dawn on the 29th, 3 cruisers and 2 destroyers had been sunk, while the battleship Vittorio Veneto was damaged, an outcome that deterred the Italian surface fleet from making any further attempt to interdict British troop movements to Greece. Spring brought an increasing flow of decrypts about Wehrmacht operations in the eastern Mediterranean. Senior officers strove to streamline the transfer of information from Bletchley to battlefields so that material reached commanders in real time. One of the most significant intercepts, detailing German plans for the May 1941 invasion of Crete, reported probable date of ending preparations 17/5. Proposed course of operation: sharp attack against enemy air force, military camps, and AA positions. Troops of Fliegerkorps 11 parachute landing to occupy Malines, Candia, and Erquion. Transfer to dive bombers and fighters to Malines and Candia. Air landing operations by remainder of Fliegerkorps 11. Sea transport of flak units, further army elements and supplies. Churchill personally annotated the flimsy. In view of the great importance of this, I should like the actual text transmitted by most secret, together with warnings about absolute secrecy. This information was passed to Wavell and Freyberg, the relevant commanders, at 23:40 on the 6th of May. The loss of the subsequent Battle of Crete, following the German invasion, which began on the morning of the 20th, emphasized a fundamental reality about Enigma decrypts. They could change outcomes only when British commanders and troops on the ground were sufficiently strong, competent, and courageous effectively to exploit them. Stuart Milner Barry of Hut 6 said that he and his colleagues looked back on Crete as the greatest disappointment of the war. It seemed a near certainty that, with every detail of the operation spelt out for us in advance, the attack would be ignominiously thrown back. The Cretan signal informing British generals of German intentions in time to respond was an exception rather than a commonplace in 1941. Bletchley was able to provide an ever-growing flow of information about the deployments of the enemy, not least in Eastern Europe. Most of it derived from Luftwaffe and Army Luftwaffe decrypts. Wehrmacht traffic stubbornly resisted penetration, but German railway codes provided information about, for instance, troop movements to Yugoslavia, Greece, and Eastern Europe in the summer of 1941. Hitler's looming invasion of the Soviet Union, the towering event of the war, was also the first great strategic development for which ultra-intelligence provided explicit warning. While Britain had no power to influence or impede Hitler's Operation Barbarossa, it was clearly of the highest importance to Churchill and his generals to be able to monitor its unfolding. It became a source of increasing frustration to the Prime Minister that British troops in North Africa failed to frustrate or defeat Rommel when they had not only superiority in men, tanks, and guns, but also an ever-growing stream of information about German deployments and movements, for instance at Halfaya Pass in May. Churchill pored intently over his own daily file of ultra material. When he read a decrypt reporting petrol stocks at various Luftwaffe fields in Libya, he scrawled on it in his red ink, Cass, Chief of Air Staff, how many hours flying can their AC do on this? About. WSC. Air Chief Marshal Sir Charles Portal responded testily, unfortunately, it is not possible to make any general deduction since the figures only relate to the stock at Benghazi. We do not possess complete figures for the supply and consumption of oil and petrol throughout Libya. All we know is that there are indications of an overall shortage which is limiting operations in the forward area. This problem was endemic when decrypts were fragmentary. Stuart Menzies performed an important service by dissuading the Prime Minister from fulfilling his frequent desire to dispatch raw, ultra-direct to commanders-in-chief in the field, as he had done in the case of Crete. C was surely correct, on security grounds, and also because decrypts that lacked the context of other intelligence could be highly misleading to untrained eyes. On land, in 1941, Bletchley provided more guidance to strategy than to tactics. It gave Churchill's High Command an authoritative, though never comprehensive, picture of German deployments in every theater of war. Ultra could do little to assist the RAF's ongoing struggle with the Luftwaffe for mastery of the skies. Only the Royal Navy gained immediate advantage, both in the Mediterranean and the Atlantic. Nothing altered the fact that, until the worldwide balance of strength began to shift in the Allies' favor in the latter part of 1942, the operational superiority of German and Japanese forces enabled them to keep winning victories. Bletchley was an increasingly important weapon, but it was not a magic sword. The practices and disciplines of GC and CS evolved progressively, with many wrangles and turf wars along the way. Deputy Director Nigel de Grey complained about the very low standards of military behavior prevailing in what was supposed to be a military establishment. But how could it be otherwise? Noel Annan wrote, many of the cryptanalysts who produced Ultra were agnostic, heterodox dons, who did not set much store by the normal interpretations of patriotism and democracy. It was not easy to combine the discipline essential to the operation's smooth functioning and sensitivity to the wayward and frankly eccentric character of some of its resident geniuses. Colonel Tiltman wrote ruefully on the 2nd of March 1941, cryptanalysts have to be handled delicately and do not take kindly to service methods of control, which are essential to the good working of signals. When the director of the Royal Navy's women personnel visited the park, she demanded, indignantly, why are my wrens working with civilians? WAAFs in the teleprinter room expressed resentment about taking orders from civilians. In December 1940, the War Office's Director of Military Intelligence staged a grab for Bletchley's military output. Until 1941, the Admiralty tried to continue some cryptographic work under its own roof. In Hut 3, rows erupted between representatives of the three armed services. Stuart Menzies received a constant stream of complaints from rival interests, while Bletchley staff referred to Broadway without enthusiasm as the other side. One of the most durable criticisms of C is that he was ever eager to accept credit for the achievements of the park, while declining to engage with its chronic resource problems, which eventually prompted the October 1941 letter to Churchill signed by Turing and his colleagues pleading for more staff that caused Churchill to send his famous "Action this day" message. Make sure they have all they want on extreme priority. It is a serious charge against Menzies that he was an absentee landlord of GCCS. Yet all this made mercifully little impact on the work of the codebreakers. Edward Thomas, a naval officer who worked at the park, was impressed by the absence of hierarchical distinctions. Despite the high tension of much of the work, anyone of whatever rank or degree could approach anyone else, however venerable, with an idea or suggestion, however crazy. Few people of any rank or status felt denied a voice, an unusually rare and privileged state of affairs in the wartime institutions of any nation. From 1941, the Cambridge scientist and novelist C.P. Snow became a key Whitehall intermediary, responsible for channeling suitable mathematicians and other scholars to Bletchley. GC and CS also employed thousands of humbler folk, recruited chiefly for their language skills. Its files record details of some RAF personnel interviewed, such as leading aircraftsman Barry, aged 23, who had started training as a pilot but remustered owing to his conscientious objections to dropping bombs. His German language skills were graded only B, and the recruiters noted, if interested in work, might do well, but needs careful handling. LAC Gray was also ex-aircrew, grounded as a result of crash, had B-grade Spanish. Corporal Hodges, aged 26, was unfit for aircrew, anxious to use his German A. In civil life, worked in architect's office. AC1 Tew was 28-year-old clerk, had German A, as well as some Spanish, French, and Danish, acquired while working in his father's leather trading business. There was much snapping between Bletchley and the Air Ministry about the latter's reluctance to grant commissioned rank to RAF men seconded to cipher or wireless interception duties. Group Captain Blandy of the Y Service complained that such people were picked individuals having considerable linguistic qualifications and a high standard of education. Mere aircraftsmen and NCOs lack the necessary authority required to carry out their duties efficiently. Not all the personnel posted to Bletchley proved suited to its demands. A March 1941 report on an RAF officer returned to general duties after a spell at BP noted, although an excellent linguist, he does not appear to me to have any aptitude or inclination for the research side of the work. He had been relegated to clerical tasks, but did not seem thus to justify his pay. There were equally bleak verdicts on the performance of some women staffers lower down the hierarchy. Wren Kenwick is inaccurate, very slow, and not a bit keen on her work. Not very intelligent. Wren's Buchanan and Ford are unintelligent and slow and seem unable to learn. Wren Rogers suffers from mild claustrophobia and cannot work in a windowless room. The report concluded the remainder are doing most excellent work, but the selectors were urged to recognize the importance of the jobs the women were required to fulfill, and not to send us too many of the cook and messenger type. Enfolded within their oppressive security blanket, Bletchley's people lived, loved, and largely played within their own community. Almost all were paid a pittance. 19-year-old mathematician Mavis Lever, one of Dilly Knox's team, initially received 30 shillings a week, of which she paid 21 shillings for her lodgings. When staff did escape into the world beyond the perimeter fence, the civilian status of the young men incurred dark suspicions among the uninitiated about their absence from any battlefield. The dramas and pantomimes performed by the park's amateur dramatic society became high spots in the annual calendar. Frank Birch, formerly of King's College, Cambridge, and now head of Hut 4, was celebrated for his appearances as the widow Twankey in productions of the pantomime Aladdin. By 1942, Common Sense had achieved some important successes in the park's management. Each section worked on its appointed head, irrespective of rank or lack of it. Cryptanalysis for all Britain's armed forces was handled entirely at Bletchley and its Indian outstations, a concentration of effort that neither Germany nor the United States ever matched. Gordon Welchman emerged as the foremost lubricator, curbing feuding. Several notoriously stupid service officers were transferred out. The popular Eric Jones was appointed to head Hut 3. It was acknowledged that the civilian codebreakers must be ridden on the lightest possible rein, though the director was prone to occasional surges of authoritarianism. On the 1st of February 1942, Admiral Karl Dönitz introduced a reflector, or fourth rotor, into the Atlantic U-boat service's Enigma, with immediate and calamitous results for Allied fortunes in the Battle of the Atlantic. This imposed a 26-fold increase in the range of possible settings, and blinded Bletchley. Sinkings soared. At sea, the Royal Navy was obliged to rely upon Huff Duff to locate enemy submarines until these approached within range of underwater detection by the Aztecs of convoy escorts, which were important against night surface attacks. Breaking what was now designated the Shark submarine key became the park's foremost priority, a challenge unresolved for 9 frightening months, by far the most stressful period of the war for those engaged in the task. They knew as they sat hunched over their labors in those austere huts that at sea men were dying every day because of their failure, though no rational person would have called it such. Also, on the 1st of February, coincidentally, Alistair Denniston was pushed aside into a subordinate London role, to be replaced by his deputy, Edward Travis. In some measure, this development reflected a clash of personalities. Denniston and Stuart Menzies disliked each other, together with the infighting characteristic of any large bureaucracy. But it was widely felt at Bletchley that its operational head was being overwhelmed by the strains of running an establishment that since the outbreak of war had increased 4-fold in size, and many times that much in its importance to the war effort. Power struggles were unavoidable. Denniston was a good and kind man who had done many things well, but Bletchley had outgrown him. Travis, whose edicts were issued in a curious trademark brown ink, was generally considered a success in his new role, not least by such influential creative figures as Welchman. When another codebreaker, Ralph Bennett, returned that summer from detached duty in the Middle East, he found that the atmosphere had changed markedly. I had left as one of a group of enthusiastic amateurs. I returned to a professional organization with standards and an acknowledged reputation to maintain. Success was no longer an occasional prize, but the natural reward of relentless attention to detail. Throughout 1942, Bletchley's activities were hampered by a desperate shortage of bombs, and thus by argument about their best employment. In January, the Army Luftwaffe Hut 6 was receiving 1,400 intercepts a day, of which an average of 580 were broken, a proportion that slowly increased, reaching about 50% by May 1943. Often no more than one 3-wheel bomb was available at any given time to work on the Shark U-boat Cipher, because the others of what was still only a handful of machines were committed to breaking Army and air traffic. The codebreakers said later that they would have needed 10 four-wheel bombs, which did not then exist, significantly to accelerate their progress. By November, a note of desperation had entered the Admiralty's pleas to the park about Shark. The Battle of the Atlantic, said the Navy's Operational Intelligence Center, was the one campaign which BP are not at present influencing to any marked extent, and it is the only one in which the war can be lost unless BP do help. A critical breakthrough was imminent, however. On the 30th of October, in the eastern Mediterranean, U-559 was attacked by an escort group and forced to the surface by depth charging. Tony Fasson, 30-year-old first lieutenant of the destroyer Petard, along with able seaman Colin Crazier, hastily stripped naked and swam 60 yards to the stricken submarine, then hauled themselves onto the conning tower. The crew had opened the seacocks before abandoning their boat, and the sea was flooding in even as the two men searched the control room with desperate urgency. They found treasure. The second edition of the Wetterkurzschlüssel, or weather short signal book, for its enigma. Having wrapped this and other documents in waterproofing, Fasson and Grazier handed them up the hatch to 16-year-old NAAFI canteen assistant Tommy Brown, who had followed in swimming to the U-boat. He, in turn, passed the packages to the crew of a whaleboat, which arrived alongside in the nick of time. Brown, a civilian, lived to receive a George Medal for his daring, but the two supremely dedicated British sailors pushed their luck by plunging once more into the submarine's control room, possibly in the belief that they might retrieve a cipher machine. Bletchley did not need this, for he had already reconstructed the wiring of a four-rotor Enigma. It was the signal books that mattered. U-559 suddenly vanished into the Mediterranean, taking with it Fasson and Grazier, both of whom received posthumous George Crosses. The captured documents reached Bletchley on the 24th of November and made possible the critical break into the Shark Key on the 13th of December, assisted by data from weather decrypts secured by Hut-10. That day, the codebreakers teleprinted to the Admiralty's Operational Intelligence Center locations for 12 Atlantic U-boats. Their positions were by now a week out of date, but they sufficed to provide critical guidance about the Germans' likely courses. Thereafter, shark signals were frequently broken within 24 hours, though the delay sometimes extended to 48. This was one of the indisputably decisive moments of the intelligence war. Once regular shark decrypts began to flow through to the Royal Navy, the balance in the war at sea shifted dramatically. Though Hut-8 later suffered more delays and difficulties with Shark, never thereafter was British control of the Atlantic Sea route seriously threatened, and U-boat sinkings soared. Among much else remarkable about Bletchley were not its periodic rows and tantrums, but that the frontline codebreakers, whose average age was 23, sustained such a degree of fellowship. Derek Taunt described how they felt devoted to the task of outwitting the enemy and happy to be part of a complicated organization designed to do just that. Rolf Nosquith paid tribute to what he described as the Hut's exemplary leadership. The integrity of the decoding operation was much assisted by the personal friendship between Stuart Milner Barry of Hut 6 and Hugh Alexander of Hut 8. But tranquility could never be attainable when thousands of men and women were working under appalling pressure around the clock, month upon month, year after year, knowing that lives depended upon their efforts. On the 15th of May 1943, Welchman wrote to Nigel Degré, apologizing for an explosion of rage during a discussion about organization and shortage of resources, an ongoing bugbear. My touchiness, he wrote, is probably due to the fact that I always have the extreme value and urgency of our work very much on my mind. Throughout the whole history of Hut 6, there was never a time at which I felt that we were being as efficient as we could be, and you can imagine that this has been a heavy and continuous strain. The present situation is an absolute scandal. and there is nothing we lack now that has not been asked for again and again. So please forgive me for being somewhat bitter and ill-tempered." He added, "A great deal of the work is terribly monotonous and deadly dull, and this has a very serious effect on morale over a long period. Some of the girls are almost physically sick at the sight of a Type 10 machine. Now if our girls crack up as many have done, we are absolutely sunk, and no amount of belated assistance will save us. Incidentally, could you possibly persuade Travis to get Air Marshal Charles Medhurst, RAF Director of Intelligence, and the CIGS General Sir Alan Brooke to spend even 1 minute telling the girls that their work is important? Yours ever, Gordon." But difficulties persisted in securing qualified personnel, not least because so few people in Whitehall had an inkling of the supreme priority of GC and CS's work. When BP needed personnel to operate punch card machines, its recruiters turned to employees of the John Lewis Partnership, the department store chain which had personnel trained to use them. Astoundingly, after 10 women had been selected, the Ministry of Labor insisted that they should instead be dispatched to do land work. An internal memo at the park seethed. "The John Lewis episode is a disgrace." The girls were eventually released to GC and CS, but only after a bitter wrangle with the civil bureaucracy. From the war's first day to its last, security was an obsession of every Allied officer privy to the ultra-secret. In 1941, a certain Colonel Gribble, who had served as an air liaison officer with the RAF in France in 1940, published a book entitled Diary of a Staff Officer, which caused near hysteria when Whitehall noticed, because it contained references to unidentified secret sources. Gribble's work had been passed by a censor who knew nothing of Bletchley Park. What if somebody in Berlin read it and drew lethal inferences about the vulnerability of Germany's ciphers? MI5 bought up and pulped 7,000 unsold copies of the book, trusting to luck that none of its existing buyers had German friends. Before the fall of Singapore in February 1942, the key local Ultra and Y service personnel received priority for evacuation, as did their American counterparts on Corregidor 2 months later. Had they fallen into captivity, not only would they have suffered a ghastly fate alongside other British and Australian prisoners, and their rare skills have been lost, but the risk to Allied code breaking was frightening if they were exposed to interrogation and torture. Most of Bletchley's staff displayed marvelous conscientiousness about secrecy, all the more remarkable among young men and women, Station 10's foot soldiers, performing humdrum functions. In 1941, a civilian doctor in Nottingham wrote to the GC and CS authorities reporting that one of his patients, a wren named Adele Maloney, was in bed with a high temperature, having overstayed her leave with symptoms of acute exhaustion. He wrote, "Miss Maloney has hypertrophy of the conscience, to such an extent that she will not divulge the smallest details of what she does, even though it is against her interests. As I find it difficult to believe that this young girl is on work which is so important that her doctor must have his hands tied by lack of knowledge, I thought I would write to ask for your comments." Bletchley responded blandly that there is, in the ordinary way, nothing that we know of in the work that she does that is in any way likely to be prejudicial to her health. The same work is done by a large number of other girls, none of whom so far, as we know, have suffered in any way. But BP told the doctor that Miss Maloney's discretion was not merely correct, but highly commendable, and so indeed it was. There was much unease among the administrators about the security risk posed by the rolling population of cooks, cleaners, and workmen who serviced Station 10. A 1941 report reflected uneasily, "New faces are being sent daily from the labor exchange to Bletchley Park. A series of flagrant breaches in the spring of 1942 prompted a magisterial memorandum to all personnel from the park's senior security officer. There have been recent instances among you of a spirit of such reckless disregard for the consequences of indiscretion as would seem to argue not only a condition of ignorance or folly, but a contempt for the laws by which each one of us knows himself to be bound. In one instance, a BP staffer disclosed the nature of their duties within her family circle. This was repeated by one of its members in mixed company, actually at a cocktail party, whence it was duly reported to me. In another instance, one of the most vital tasks in which the organization is engaged was disclosed, possibly in the spirit of pride or ostentation, in an after-dinner conversation to the seniors of this person's old college, whence a report reached me. It would be a reflection of your intelligence to suppose that you do not realize that an idle piece of boasting or gossip may be passed to the enemy and cause not only the breakdown of our successful efforts here, but the sacrifice of the lives of our sailors, soldiers, and airmen, perhaps your own brothers, and may even prejudice our ultimate hopes of victory. If this broadside was fiercely worded, it was not in the smallest degree extravagant. Bletchley Park was the jewel in the crown of Britain's war effort, one of its principal assets in the struggle to save the nation from Nazi enslavement. Alan Brooke wrote in his diary after visiting GC&CS in April 1942, "A wonderful set of professors and geni. I marvel at the work they succeed in doing. Betrayal of its secrets could overnight have crippled the cause for freedom, most immediately by denying to the Royal Navy its key to the locations of Dönitz's U-boats. Well before the Soviet Union became a supposed ally in June 1941, British traders were passing to NKVD agents whatever pearls of ultra they thought might be of interest to Moscow. It was fortunate that Stalin did not inform Hitler of Bletchley's doings. In the months before Barbarossa, he was desperate to appease Berlin. It was an even larger stroke of fortune that Germany's commanders sustained their dogged belief in Enigma's inviolability. Early in the 1930s, the head cryptanalyst of Göring's Forschungsamt Cipher unit, Dr. Georg Schröder, asserted passionately, "The whole Enigma is garbage." No heed was taken of his warning, which was deemed only relevant to the commercial machine, which lacked a plugboard. In October 1939, Lieutenant Colonel Gruzik, former head of Czech cryptanalysis, revealed to German interrogators that the Poles had been working with the French to break Enigma traffic. In captured Polish files, the Nazis discovered 3 1938 plain language translations of signals from a German cruiser in Spanish waters. Polish POWs were exhaustively interrogated in attempts to discover how these messages had been decrypted, but the Abwehr drew a blank. Almost all the men who knew the answers were at the time beyond their reach. OKW/Cheese cryptanalysts in Berlin felt intensely frustrated that, while they were supposedly responsible for ensuring the security of the Wehrmacht's communications, they were expressly forbidden to conduct tests on breaking Enigma traffic. They nonetheless believed the system institutionally safe, and argued that occasional signals could only be broken if dispatched by careless operators who neglected procedure. Even in 1946, the Wehrmacht's chief cryptanalyst, Wilhelm Fenner, maintained stubbornly the Enigma was regarded as antiquated, but it was secure when properly used. It is possible to identify several moments of the war at which British blunders could have enabled the Germans to recognize that their ciphers were compromised, and plug the gusher of intelligence flowing from Bletchley Park. On the 24th of August 1941, Churchill made a BBC broadcast in which he alluded to explicit numbers of Jews known to have been murdered by the SS behind the Eastern Front. The Germans noticed, and within days, Oberstgruppenführer Kurt Daluege, issued an order that details of such killings should no longer be mentioned in radio traffic. The danger of enemy decryption of wireless messages is great. For this reason, only non-sensitive information should be transmitted. One consequence of Churchill's slip was that when in October 1942, the Foreign Office compiled a report on known German atrocities, especially those committed against Jews, this was not publicly released, to avoid any new risk of compromising intelligence sources. It was remarkable that the German High Command failed to draw far-reaching conclusions from Churchill's August 1941 words, and likewise a year later when German interrogation of Allied prisoners revealed that Montgomery's 8th Army had been expecting the Afrika Korps attack at Alam Halfa in North Africa. Early in 1942, also, Dönitz became acutely suspicious that the Allies were monitoring his communications with U-boats. He was persuaded that his fears were groundless by British carelessness with their own convoy codes, which were being broken by the Kriegsmarine decryption service, the B-Dienst. If Enigma was indeed insecure, the Admiral reasoned, the British would have learned about this yawning chasm in their own security. A nation clever enough to crack U-boat signals would employ better codes of its own. The U-boat chief was careful enough to introduce the four-rotor Enigma, but insufficiently so to question the fundamental basis of the system. Potentially the most dangerous threat to the ultra-secret also came in 1942. On the 5th of May, the Australian freighter Nankin sailed from Fremantle for Calcutta with a cargo of explosives, 180 crew, and 162 passengers. In the Indian Ocean, early on the morning of the 10th of May, a small float plane circled the ship. Soon afterwards, its parent, the German raiding cruiser Thor, closed in and opened fire. Nankin signaled, "Raider sighted," and her captain jettisoned the confidential books before surrendering an hour after the first shot. The passengers and crew were transferred to Thor and its accompanying supply ship, along with hundreds of sacks of mail. Among these, the Germans identified a consignment from the Combined Operations Intelligence Center at Wellington, New Zealand. Its contents included a most secret summary for the period 21st of March to the 20th of April, largely based on ultra material, which gave the positions of every known Allied and enemy warship and merchant vessel in the Pacific and Indian Oceans. With criminal carelessness, these documents had been dispatched not by hand of Nankin's captain, but instead with the general mail. Even though the COIC data was well out of real time, imaginative analysis of the intelligence summary by the Abwehr would have shown the Germans that some, at least, of their ciphers, as well as those of the Japanese, were compromised. Such scrutiny appears never to have taken place. The Thor's captain saw no special urgency about sending the captured documents to Berlin. Only at the end of July, after the raiding cruiser's supply ship docked at Yokohama, did Germany's naval attaché in Tokyo receive the COIC papers. A further month elapsed before Berlin authorized him to pass the documents to its Asian ally. Thereafter, the Japanese Navy changed its main code so that the U.S. Navy lacked real-time decrypts to empower its operations during the 11th through the 12th of October Battle of Cape Esperance, the 26th of October Battle of Santa Cruz, and the 13th to the 15th of November Guadalcanal actions. It would be fanciful to suggest that the Nankin captures thus altered the course of the naval war, because the code alteration was part of a regular routine. The Japanese still doggedly refused to acknowledge that their entire communication system was vulnerable. But if they had read the Allied COIC documents soon after the Germans got their hands on them, and had possessed a more sophisticated capability for assessing intelligence, they would have changed their ciphers weeks, instead of days, before launching their June assault on Midway, with momentous consequences. The British do not appear to have told the Americans about the Nankin loss. This may have been because they suffered an attack of well-deserved embarrassment about a major breach of security. It was the same story when the second of two copies of the Japanese purple cipher machine presented to the British by their American creators was dispatched to the Ultra team in Singapore by freighter. It is known to have left Durban in December 1941, but thereafter vanished without trace, its fate unknown from that day to this. No Whitehall correspondence concerning the Nankin has thus far been found in British archives, and it would be unjustified to build too high a tower of speculation around its story. The Allies escaped significant consequences from their blunder, and from the others cited above, because the intelligence systems of Germany and Japan lacked the coherence and imagination to profit as they should have done from their haul of Allied secrets. One further critically dangerous moment should be mentioned. In November 1942, the Germans swept across unoccupied France. Among those whom they took into custody in Vichy were 3 Poles who had served in Gustave Bertrand's code-breaking department since 1940, and before that had been engaged in Poland's own cryptographic operation. In March 1943, 2 such prisoners were interrogated by German SIGINT experts in the presence of an Abwehr officer. Had the men told what they knew, or could have surmised, about the Allies' progress in cracking Enigma, the worst could have happened. Fortunately, before being questioned, the Poles were briefly alone together and coordinated explanations which were accepted, that while some traffic had been briefly broken in 1938, improved German systems thereafter closed the breach. Here were 2 more people to whom the Allies owed a debt for their role preserving the ultra-secret. Cleverer men in Berlin and Tokyo might have made much of the material and prisoners that fell into their hands, and abruptly halted the music for the Allies' wondrous dance across the ether. Section 2. Flirting with America. From the day Winston Churchill became Prime Minister until Pearl Harbor 19 months later, his foremost political purpose was to drag the United States into the war, because only thus could the embattled island hope to accomplish more than its own survival. To that end, the British sought the closest cooperation the Americans would countenance. They professed to wish to extend this to intelligence, but in truth sought a notably one-sided relationship, which protected most of Britain's secrets. In the spring of 1940, Stuart Menzies asked the Canadian businessman Sir William Stephenson to try to open a link to J. Edgar Hoover, director of the FBI. Stephenson, eager for a top-table role for himself, set about his mission with a will, using an unlikely mutual acquaintance, the former world heavyweight boxing champion Gene Tunney, with whom he had sparred in France back in 1918. In those days, the Canadian had been a fighter pilot, who went on to make a fortune before creating his own industrial intelligence network in the 1930s, from which he offered material to the British government. This opened a relationship with Desmond Morton and Dick Ellis of Broadway, which continued after the outbreak of war. Hoover, before meeting the ebullient Canadian, took care to secure White House approval. Stephenson reported back to London that the FBI chief was keen to cooperate with MI6, and had suggested that his visitor should secure some official title to formalize his status in the U.S. Menzies promptly gave Stephenson a modest cover role as passport control officer in New York, where he set up shop on the 21st of June 1940. Thereafter, the Canadian built a substantial organization which in January 1941 acquired the title of British Security Coordination. BSC, quartered on the 35th and 36th floors of the Rockefeller Center on Fifth Avenue, was charged with sabotaging Axis operations, liaising with Americans, and gathering intelligence about enemy activity. It also managed anti-Axis propaganda throughout the Americas. In its role as a flag carrier for Britain and its spies, it enjoyed considerable success until the respective national intelligence services began to bypass BSC in favor of doing business with each other direct in the spring of 1942 after the US came into the war. New York became MI6's most important outstation, from which its agents set forth to try to penetrate Axis-run companies and foreign embassies. BSC could claim credit for such coups as tipping off the FBI in November 1940, when a Mexico City informant revealed that 4 German ships intended to run the British blockade across the Gulf of Mexico. The U.S. Navy stopped the ships. Likewise, J. Edgar Hoover warned BSC that the Italians intended to transfer to South America almost $4 million in cash, which might be used to bankroll sabotage. 2/3 of the money got through, but a BSC agent alerted police in Mexico City about the smuggling operation. They opened the bags and confiscated $1.4 million. On the debit side, however, Stephenson was alleged to have recruited some frankly disreputable officers. Guy Little of MI5 fumed about one in particular, Ingram Fraser, who was alleged to have been running a mistress in Washington, D.C., who was supposed to be acting as an agent on the Finns. She was getting $500 a month for her flat and $500 for her services, all paid out of office funds. BSC wasted as much energy on absurdities as every other intelligence organization. 3 of its cleverest officers, Oxford Don's Freddie Ayer, Bill Deacon, and Gilbert Hignett, spent weeks planning a response to a possible Japanese invasion of South America. What mattered most, however, was Stephenson's liaison role. He forged close personal relations with many prominent administration figures, and especially with Colonel Williams Donovan, who would become the most influential single personality in America's wartime foreign intelligence operations. Donovan was a natural showman, where the other belligerents' spy masters were men of the shadows, or, in the case of Stalin's intelligence chiefs, creatures of the night. Born in 1883, Wild Bill rose from a poor Irish background in upstate New York to become a classmate of Franklin Roosevelt at Columbia Law School. He later became an influential friend of the president. He fought with Pershing against Pancho Villa, then commanded the New York Irish 69th Regiment on the Western Front in 1917 to 1918, returning home as his nation's most decorated soldier, a colonel with the Medal of Honor, and a reasonably authentic reputation as a hero. Thereafter, he fulfilled several fact-finding missions for the White House, following the first of these to the new Soviet Union in 1919. Donovan urged Washington against supporting White Russia, describing workers in Siberia as yearning for Bolshevism. As U.S. Attorney for the Western District of New York, he became famous, or notorious, for his energetic enforcement of prohibition. Later, though himself a Republican, he visited Abyssinia and Spain as an emissary for Roosevelt the Democrat. He returned home an implacable foe of Hitler, an advocate of U.S. engagement in Europe. In 1940 and 1941, Donovan made trips to London, during which Stephenson ensured that he received red carpet treatment, including lunch with the Prime Minister. Some British officers recoiled from the visitor's brashness. Major General John Kennedy, Director of Military Operations, wrote in his diary, "Donovan is extremely friendly to us, and a shrewd and pleasant fellow, and good talker. But I could not but feel that this fat and prosperous lawyer, a citizen of a country not in the war, possessed very great assurance to be able to lay down the law so glibly about what we and other threatened nations should and should not do. Donovan's influence at the White House nonetheless ensured continuing British gratitude and goodwill. In September 1940, he persuaded Roosevelt to commit the U.S. to a policy of intelligence collaboration with Churchill's nation. When Godfrey, the director of naval intelligence, visited the U.S. in May 1941 with his personal assistant, Commander Ian Fleming, in New York, the two men stayed at Donovan's apartment. The Admiral's trip was not an unqualified success. He was shocked by the depth of hostility between the U.S. Army and U.S. Navy, and got little change out of Hoover, who was less interested in joining the war against the Axis than in securing the FBI's monopoly control of the nation's intelligence activities. In this, Hoover was unsuccessful. While his bureau retained responsibility for counterespionage, the role of MI5 in Britain, Godfrey and Stevenson played some part in convincing the Roosevelt administration that the country needed a new intelligence organization, and that Donovan was the man to run it. From July 1941, he held the title of Coordinator of Information, though in reality his Office of War Information was an embryo Secret Service, and he set about supervising its birth and precautious growth with energy and exuberance. Donovan and Stevenson, the latter known in the U.S. as Little Bill rather than Intrepid, which was merely his telegraphic address, were buccaneers both, who shared credit for securing a reasonably free hand for British intelligence operations in the Americas, against the wishes of the FBI and the State Department. Their rapport did not, however, change an overarching reality. The wartime relationship between Britain and the United States was characterized by tensions and suspicions, merely painted over by the magnificent rhetoric of Churchill and Roosevelt. In 1940-41, the British were fighting for their lives while Americans were not, and indeed operated a cash-and-carry policy for the modest quota of weapons and supplies they sold to Churchill's people. Most of America's defense community had some respect for Britain, but little affection. The British officers, privy to the ultra-secret, knew that they were custodians of one of their country's most precious assets, which would become instantly forfeit if any hint of their growing successes reached Berlin. American security was poor, as might be expected of a people not yet committed to the struggle, who were anyway constitutionally ill-suited to keeping secrets. British intelligence chiefs were eager for American goodwill, but doubtful how much of practical value their U.S. counterparts could tell them. Pending evidence that a two-way traffic could benefit their embattled island, they determined to give away as little as possible. Moreover, as an anguished Whitehall hand scribbled during the 1941 debate about how much to tell a visiting U.S. delegation, "What will they think if they find we have been reading their own stuff?" A mild embarrassment about which Churchill came clean to Roosevelt on the 25th of February 1942, with the assurance that decryption of U.S. material had stopped immediately after Pearl Harbor. The sparse 1940-41 meetings and exchanges between the two nations' codebreakers and intelligence officers took place in a climate of mutual wariness, and it was the Americans who displayed greater frankness. On the 31st of August 1940, the British were told that the Signals Intelligence Service had broken the Japanese Purple Key. This revelation prompted no immediate invitation to Bletchley. When the Tizard mission visited the U.S. in September to show off such revolutionary technology as the cavity magnetron, a tempting morsel key to New Age tactical radar and intended to promote American reciprocity, information about Ultra was explicitly excluded. On the American side, Lawrence Safford of the U.S. Navy's OP-20G code-breaking team was likewise opposed to sharing its secrets with the British. In December 1940, the two nations reached an agreement to pool information about code breaking, but both were slow to bring this into effect. Only on Japanese material was there immediate close collaboration. In February 1941, the British cryptanalysis team in Singapore and its American counterpart in the Philippines exchanged liaison officers, who discovered that both were in about the same place with Tokyo's codes. In the early war years, the British did better than the Americans in monitoring some low-level Japanese armed forces traffic, though they failed to break into their higher ciphers. Nonetheless, when British forces in 1941 requested urgent American assistance in securing high-altitude photographs of Japan's naval bases, Washington vetoed the proposal. At the height of the Luftwaffe Blitz on Britain, two FBI agents, Hugh Clegg and Clarence Hinds, visited London to study law enforcement in time of war. Guy Little, of MI5, thought that while the visitors looked somewhat thuggish, Clegg seemed a very good fellow. Such warmth was not reciprocated. On their return, the two men delivered to Hoover a report depicting the British, explicitly MI5, and the Metropolitan Police in terms of withering scorn. They complained that it was difficult to arrange meetings before 10 a.m. or after 4 p.m. because the transport situation is very difficult, you know. They said that the fact exploratory luncheons were usually 2 hours in length made our working day rather limited, particularly when compared to the customary hours that officials of the FBI are engaged in official business. They concluded that the British might win the war if they find it convenient. This report set the tone for the FBI's view of the British for decades thereafter. In January 1941, when an American code-breaking team, 2 Army, 2 Navy, paid a pioneering visit to Britain, they brought with them a remarkably generous gift, a mimicked purple machine, of which a second copy was handed over later. The British, however, reciprocated cautiously. With Winston Churchill's explicit sanction, they admitted the visitors to Bletchley and explained the HUT system. They revealed the bombs, GC&CS's most critical innovation, but thereafter prevaricated about fulfilling American requests to be given an example of what Washington described as a cipher-solving machine. There were very good reasons for this. The U.S. was not in the war, and the bombs were scarce pearls. The Americans recognized that they had seen in action a system way ahead of anything the U.S. armed forces were doing. Alfred McCormick, who became the Secretary for War's Special Assistant on Comment, said later of Bletchley, "It's not good. It's superb." Some people in Washington, however, were irked by apparent British pusillanimity. They themselves made little serious headway in reading Enigma traffic until floodgates opened in 1943, and, in the words of an exasperated British officer, showed no appreciation of the extent of the problems facing Bletchley Park and Britain. The park's Washington representative, Captain Edward Hastings, reported in November 1941 that there is a grave unrest and dissatisfaction about free exchange of special intelligence. Some Americans were doggedly convinced that the British were holding out on them. As late as December 1942, when Alan Turing visited the U.S., he was denied admission to the Bell Laboratories in revenge for alleged British foot-dragging about collaboration, and was finally allowed inside only after a huge and protracted transatlantic row. Although William Friedman later forged warm personal relations with BP's senior personnel, he himself made his first visit to Britain only in May 1943, about the time a formal and indeed historic intelligence sharing pact was agreed between the two nations. Meanwhile, collaboration remained wary and incomplete. Even after Pearl Harbor, Bletchley and its owners remained fearful not only about American security shortcomings, but also about the danger that this brightest jewel in the imperial crown might somehow be snatched from them by the boundlessly rich, irresistibly dominant new partner in the Grand Alliance. Alistair Denniston wrote that for Britain, Ultra was almost lifeblood, whereas the Americans seemed to view Enigma with the detachment of distance and freedom from mortal peril, merely as a new and very interesting problem. The War Office's Deputy Director of Military Intelligence wrote on the 17th of February, 1942, 10 weeks after Pearl Harbor, that in talking to the Americans, the general policy is to be as frank as possible, but no information will be given regarding our own future operations or sources of information, nor will any information be passed which emanates from special most secret sources, Ultra. On the 16th of March, the Cabinet Secretary, Sir Edward Bridges, wrote a memorandum warning that telephone conversations between London and Washington still reveal instances of gross American lack of discretion. Stuart Menzies and his officers at MI6 remained reluctant to open their hearts and files to their new brothers-in-arms. Unfortunately, the British obfuscation, which persisted through much of 1942, prompted misunderstandings and mounting anger among some Americans. These crystallized around a belief, entirely mistaken, that Bletchley had broken into the U-boat Shark Key but was refusing to tell the U.S. Navy about it. Op 20G's eventual exasperated riposte to Bletchley's unwillingness to surrender a bomb was to announce in September 1942, and to begin to fulfill in August of the following year, its own commitment to build 4 rotor models by the 100. This was a time when the British had just 32. The American machines proved technically superior to the British models, and also more reliable. In October 1943, 39 were operational, and by December, 75. Though, by the time these became operational, much of their capacity proved superfluous to U.S. Navy needs. In the early war years, British intelligence collaboration with the U.S. was cautious. Only from 1943 onwards did it become wholehearted. As with so much else about Anglo-American relations, however, it is less surprising that there was so much squabbling at the outset, in the years of Allied defeat, than that the partnership eventually achieved the intimacy that it did in the years of victory. Hello everyone, it's been quite a while. I have had issues with the recording part, there were issues with corruption on files, and then also there was a large portion of time where I just didn't have the motivation to actually record. This chapter felt, for some reason, extremely long, and I know I had promised to try to make the posts more regular, and I didn't, so I'll definitely try at least to actually get through this next chapter in a more timely fashion, but I can't make any promises. It can end up being like another 2 months maybe. I will, however, try to shorten that as much as I can. It has been an experience, and honestly, I am kind of impressed that I got through this entire mess. But thank you for being so patient for this video, and so understanding of just the shit that goes into this. I appreciate all of you for always listening, and I appreciate all the support that you can give. And I'd appreciate any comments, suggesting for new sort of suggestions and new video ideas and stuff. Maybe other books that I should read in the future and such things. Thank you all for watching, or listening, I guess. And I'll catch you in the next one, whenever that is. Stay safe. Cheerio.